Dead Rising 1 gets all the love for the cut content, but Dead Rising 2's unused details paint a fascinating picture of what almost was. From cut characters to over 100 cut items to early plot beats, Blue Castle Studios left just enough on the disc to get an idea of the changes made to the best game Capcom ever published. So, let's not dawdle. Everything here was gathered from the cutting room floor, which means everything came from the YouTuber throwing out rocks. Link to the page and his YouTube channel down below. Let's keep it simple and start with the text page, which features strings of, what else? Text, all of which would be used throughout the game at various points. One such example is every marked mission having a call from Stacy. Most of these were repurposed and off the record with voice acting to boot, although they changed any reference from Chuck to Frank, and there's a few missions that got cut from that game, like Dead or Alive, Workers' Compensation, and Meet the Contestants, all of which have unused mission calls. Now, the most interesting of these mission calls is Chemical Dependency, as it is completely separate from what we got in Off the Record. This is the mission where Jared needs his second dose of Zombirex. First, it would have been the longest call of any mission update in the franchise, with Stacy, Sullivan, and even Jared himself fighting for the walkie to get Chuck's attention. Sullivan's string has an interesting detail of referencing Room 2. This implies that the survivors were originally divided into separate rooms like they were in the first game, which would explain why the bunker is so expansive. In the final game, this mechanic is only used for the strip poker game. Then there's this conversation, which features presumably Sullivan telling Chuck about the infection spreading and that he had to kill everyone. This is where I have to disagree with throwing out rocks, as he believes this meant that everyone in the bunker died if Jared isn't given Zombirex in time. But I actually think that, factoring in Sullivan's exact choice of words, it's more likely Jared would turn and start biting survivors in Room 2, and Sullivan, under the guise of containing the infection with the real goal of minimizing witnesses, kills everyone in the room. This also means that Jared's Zombirex crisis is meant to be the game's second mutiny, mechanically speaking, which would explain why both versions of Dead Rising 2 only have one proper survivor uprising. But since survivors now make themselves convenient for Chuck when they have or need something, it makes very little sense for Jared to be surrounded by people when on the verge of turning, so it just became his life on the line. While on the subject of survivors with revealing text, Lulu the Playboy Bunny, she's barely present in the game proper, but she has rescue dialogue for Chuck getting her back to the bunker like any other survivor. Strangely, she says "we" in her rescue dialogue, which only survivors who are part of groups would say. The internal data suggests Lulu was connected to Here Comes the Groom at one point, so it may have been that Randy originally had several women hostage and not just Danny, which would support the line of "the others." However, her saying that Chuck saved him from being zombie bait doesn't really match that mission's events. Her tone is way too jovial for that mission's context, and the only other dialogue found relating to Randy's battle is a less subtle version of a line that he actually did go with. There are two other female survivor names in the files with no data attached to them, Vanessa and Catherine, and an unused mission called The Other Girls, so it's possible that Lulu was meant to be part of that quest. Maybe all of them were meant to be Playboy bunnies. Regardless of where she was going to be, it seems the Playboy company didn't approve of their bunnies being hurt, killed, or zombified. Thus, Lulu got demoted to just being an Easter egg in the bunker. Then again, maybe I'm overthinking this. After all, Rebecca has a string of text for when she was brought back to the safe house during Case File 6, so maybe Lulu's unused line is just thanking Chuck after he solves the whole safe house getting breached. Okay, we've squeezed out everything we can with the optional stuff.
Are you sure about that?
Let's move on with the plot. How on brand for the series. There's a string of text for TK introducing everyone one by one. It confirms everyone at the event was a survivor of the Las Vegas outbreak, except for Ainum, who survived Willamette. Chris was originally Bobby, and Ainum was originally Ronald. If you didn't know, Dead Rising 2 survivors are named after the Blue Castle Studio devs. Check the credits, you'll see some familiar names. There's also an unfinished cutscene that would play after the elevator halts, but before Chuck wakes up.
Well, for all that whining about equal rights, I don't see why she can't get her own damn drink. I'm totally missing out on all the action. Yeah, well, I better get some action from her later, after all that shit I put up with. Oh, man. Sounds like something totally awesome is happening. Dude, you're breaking up. Hey, hello? Hey, you still there?
Speaking of which, Chuck originally called for help when the elevator stalled, implying that he originally didn't black out for a moment like he does in the final game. They likely took out him calling for help in favor of him brute forcing his way out to reinforce his agency as a father. The next two strings of text seem to be for when the player gets to the bunker. When the doors behind them close but the ones in front of them don't open, someone, presumably Chuck, mutters, "3 days my ass," and then tells Katie they need to look for a way out. I guess at that point Chuck already knew about the standard operating procedure of waiting 3 days in that draft. We then see a woman trying to call her mother, claiming that she survived the Las Vegas outbreak, but wasn't without its damage. This likely belonged to Tamara, and was streamlined into the far more ominous,
"I can't get a signal. Why? Why can't I get a signal?"
Chuck asks the survivor what they're looking at. Presumably this would be Katie's bite mark. There's a line that I can only imagine is a survivor banging on the door to be let in, and there's someone wondering how the zombies could have gotten out. That last one is probably the Terror is Reality employee Wade. Wade also has some unused voice lines that imply the player was originally going to follow him through the Platinum Strip to the bunker, and that he could have even died if the player took too long.
"Over here! This way to the safe house! Help! Help! Ah! 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 No! Ah! Get to the safe house! The safe house is this way! No! We're with you! Stay back! I'm on your side!
The next line is someone threatening to sue, and I'd wager it's Skylar after he lost his girlfriend. Said girlfriend was supposed to have a unique character model, and there's a reference to it in the game's files, but it's unfinished and apparently untextured. The final line is who I presume to be Crystal, wondering how any of this could happen. This is, again, condensed in the final version. That would lead to a very unique exchange, as apparently Sullivan had no intention of letting them in, and it was only through Stacy's intervention that the door was opened. While it would have been nice for Stacy to make a more active first impression, this interaction makes Sullivan's betrayal a bit too obvious. Sure, more genre-savvy players can already pick up in the base game, but his first interaction being his refusal to help the main playable character get back in alive would have been a little too on the nose. That's the running theme for the cut lines of the story. Make them more concise and leave more to the player to think about. Stacy's the only character who got the short end of this approach, but she's already one of the more developed characters in the game. Up next, we have 2 lines of dialogue, at least one belonging to Sullivan after Chuck brings a survivor back for the first time, indicating that there was originally going to be a scanner to tell if someone was infected. This was likely removed as it was too convenient of a device to exist in the game's setting, and it would make convincing the trigger-happy Sullivan to let the infected Jared stay in the bunker way too difficult. Also, in my mind, for some reason it looks like the TF2 Sapper, not sure why. There's also a short conversation related to Case 1, implying that Rebecca's crew abandoned her in real time and that she was interviewing someone from Cure. There's a few unused protesters in the coding that could have been used for this cutscene. Skipping a few lines that would have Stacy call the player after cutscenes like Otis used to, there's banter from various soldiers underneath Boykin's command. So perhaps we were meant to get more of a display of their dynamics originally. The most interesting of these lines imply that Boykin may not have been the only survivor of the initial gas zombie mutations, beyond the 2 that we find. Sadly, no confirmation that 8-Ball was ever going to be present. Truly a dark day for the Dead Rising fandom. There is, however, a short string of text, along with an unused cutscene, for what would originally happen when you stop the zombies from breaching the bunker.
Close call. Don't worry, I'll get the rest of them.
It seems TK getting infected wasn't always a plot point. You can check the rest of the lines out on the cutting room floor. The rest of the story bits are either variations of existing dialogue, or lines that were cut so the characters' actions could speak for themselves. The optional cutscenes, however, have some compelling implications. For example, Chef Antoine's line about being put off by Chuck's dislike of butter suggests that he initially assumed Chuck just didn't like his food, rather than Chuck not being the reviewer. Brandon also originally said word for word, "What have I done?" before preventing his zombification. A line cut short, likely to leave his outlook up to player interpretation instead. The last section of text for cutscenes is hard to pin down when they'd be used. There's a few lines for Terra is Reality, one being an unused intro, and 3 of them criticizing the players for all underperforming. The final 2 seem to be cut lines from TK's escape on his helicopter, which only happens if Chuck runs out of time after starting the battle. But sprinkled between them are 2 lines that noticeably are not said by TK. The first is, "Heard you started all this down in Santa Cabeza. Hard to believe." And, well, you're not making any more zombies today. Now, I don't think this means Isabella was meant to appear in the base game. It is far more likely that the 2 scientists at the end of the game were meant to have worked with Barnaby back in Santa Cabeza. This might have been Chuck's original stinger after he defeated them and turned off the gas. This was probably removed because, 1, the implication of Chuck getting that information from the computer wasn't clear, and 2, they probably just wanted to make Phenotrance more of a standalone threat and not over-rely on the Santa Cabeza story. Moving away from cutscenes and going to survivor dialogue real quick, a cut conversation has Lenny saying exactly what the combination was when telling Chuck about his brother's money. It was 07121981 if you're curious. I checked the numbers and any potential dates it could refer to, but nothing of significance came up. It was likely removed to both make the interaction shorter and so the players didn't think that they needed to remember the combination for the mission. There's still a massive bank of text left in the game, but most of it's hard to pin down. As for what I can, there's some unused mission titles, one of which I already told you, Other Girls, and the other is for a mission called Last Call, which I'd wager was the original mission title for either Luscious Lady or Once Bitten. There's also a mission titled Live Free or Let Die, which is speculated to be the original name of the mission Dead or Alive. Slappy's mission was originally called The Mascot, a very Dead Rising 1 naming scheme. There's also text to indicate that Overtime Mode and 72-Hour Mode were originally separate, like in the first game. And there's text to say that the player could originally choose to skip Terra is Reality and go straight to the bunker, compared to the final game where that's decided by skipping the cutscene. And originally, napping the save in the bunker was at one point an option. Alright, enough preliminary stuff, on to the more interesting details, like cut characters. First, the 3 security guards found in Off the Record, Oscar, Dale, and Julius, were scheduled for the original game. It's safe to say their roles as arena victims were the same. There are 3 additional civilians in the game's files, Taylor Nightgale, Sarah Stayer, and Marvin Horner. All 3 of them had low health and were likely arena victims, although Sarah had the injured animations and unique voice clips. While the removal of the security guards is beyond me, Marvin was certainly removed because he and Drake, another arena victim, looked the same, and Sarah would likely die before anyone noticed the detail of her being injured. Taylor probably just drew the short straw. The weirdest of the cut characters are Cherry and Jamal. First, these 2 characters have notebook images, but do not have surnames attached to them. The only other characters who share this feature are the pawn shop looters, who have all 4 of their names in the original game's files as well. Cherry still has her cinematic character model in the game's files, and it's lumped in with the rest of the protesters, so she was likely just meant to be in the opening protest on the TV. Her in-game model is used for Helen, another arena victim. Jamal, on the other hand, is supposed to be the guy that gets eaten by zombies at 7 p.m. It could be that he was meant to be someone Chuck would meet at one point, but he could also be a leftover from Case Zero, since a Jamal dies at 7 p.m. in that game as well. Oh, right. All the characters from Case Zero are in the game's files, right down to their notebook data. I couldn't tell you if this means that the characters were meant to be in the base game first, if the notebook would be expanded to include Case Zero if you connected the 2 titles, or if they wanted to bundle Case Zero with the base game at one point in development. There's also Gary Peak. Given that his character model and notebook entry lack any textures, I'd be willing to bet he was just a test character. Still, would have been pretty funny if he was in off-the-record sandbox mode as a secret encounter. The next character does not come from the cutting room floor, but instead concept art. A character known only as the Pit Boss. The banter on the image has him talking about a few irregularities at the table, and he was probably meant to be the ringleader of Fortune City. The vibe of this implies that Terra's Reality may have had a more underground approach at some point. Either way, it's safe to say this character concept was refined into TK. The final 2 characters are, and I'm hoping I'm saying this correctly, Dmitry Kozlov and Simon Bostwick. These 2 Russian characters are the only cut notebook entries with unique descriptions, specifically describing them as hired mercenary helicopter pilots. and they're placed in the Psychopaths section of the notebook if modded in, right between Carl and Seymour. The Dead Rising wiki also claims that while their models were used for the helicopter pilots that save the player in endings A and S, they are in fact not the same characters. So, with all that information in mind, I would wager that they were originally the pilots that TK hired to escape on the helicopter, and would be listed as dead once Chuck destroyed the copter, or lost if they got away. While we're on the subject of the game's endings, there's an unused ending E. It would feature Chuck being arrested, taken into the helicopter, in a jail cell, and revealing that he was successfully framed for the outbreak. I wonder if the jail cell from Case West would have been reused. My guess is that Chuck getting caught by the military without sticking to the story would have resulted in ending E. It was likely cut because there was no logical reason to have that happen over ending D, and foreshadowing the gas zombies was deemed more important than seeing Phenotrans' plan succeed. Fortune City had an entire western portion of the map planned at one point. The aptly titled Western Land Casino was divided into 4 parts. One would be Crystal Plaza, with unique lighting effects during the day, a western town that made up the shops and restaurants, and it apparently had a gold mining operation, or at least something that passed for one. Thirdly is the Riverboat Casino, and I'd say that theming largely speaks for itself. The 4th and final one is the hotel, the only one of these to make it into the final game proper. Though, interestingly, it's described as having boss floors that the player takes elevators up to get to the penthouse. It makes me wonder if Dead Rising 2 was going to have a very different take on bosses and story progression, or if this wasn't meant for the story mode at all and this was going to be more of a scare-scraper kind of thing. Concept art from an even earlier draft showed all of Fortune City surrounded by a ravine, with the only bridge out being destroyed. We can also see that Phenotrans, back then called Biotrans, would be located on the pseudo-island. I'd wager the bridge being destroyed was to prevent the infection from spreading, along with some commentary on how control over the failure mattered more than how densely populated the town would be in the event of a zombie outbreak from the nearby lab. And honestly, I can't say I'm crazy for this version of Fortune City, however. While I love the visual design on display, it's a little too high concept for my liking, and it doesn't fit Dead Rising as a series nearly as well as proper Fortune City does. The concept art also shows off some zombie designs the final game didn't use. First, the cop zombie originally had a dark blue color scheme. Since undead cops carry weapons, this was likely changed to make them stand out more. There's zombies in a basketball jersey, which interestingly used the same color scheme as the football zombies in Dead Rising 3. The erotica dress zombies were going to return from the first game, and finally, there's a zombie wearing what I think is supposed to be a Star Gladiator shirt. The zombies aren't alone in cut costumes, however. Chuck also had some duds removed from the final game. The cowboy clothing was originally going to have a light blue variant, likely as a reference to Back to the Future. The Proto Man costume from Off the Record and the Ken Masters outfit from Dead Rising 3's PC port were both originally intended for Dead Rising 2. Moving away from costumes, Chuck was originally going to learn the Tatsumaki and the Shoryuken to match Frank's original Street Fighter moves, although it's not known if they would have used their Street Fighter names. I could see them being called the Hurricane Kick and the Rising Uppercut, respectively. There are a few cut icons in the game's files. The simplest is the martini icon that was used for alcoholic beverages. Given that alcohol poisoning was a massive nerf to healing in Dead Rising 2, it would make sense to want to denote anything that contributes to it. But between beer and whiskey being used in combo weapons and the game targeting an audience that should be familiar with most alcoholic beverages, it's easy to see why it got dropped. Two less obvious icons are for a dumpster and a food cart. Interestingly, there's also a model of a dumpster that's opened up in the game's files. My guess is that originally the player was able to loot weapons and food from these kind of locations, but the feature proved to be too niche to justify keeping around. There's also an infinite ammo icon located next to all the other numbered text. It actually can still appear in the game if you mod any gun to have unlimited ammunition. But now, we're getting to the biggest detail dump in the game. Over 100 cut items from the retail release of Dead Rising 2. I'm not counting any conceptual combo weapons like the electric lead pipe. And when the inventory icons of cut weapons alone breaks into the triple digits, there's more than enough to work with. However, not every cut icon equals a completely cut weapon. For example, every single Terror's Reality weapon has an icon that goes unused, with the exception of the yellow moose head because you can find that during TK's boss fight. There's also an icon for the handle you use in that overtime mode battle to save Katie and Stacy, so originally it would have taken up an inventory slot to use. The Blitzkrieg originally had an inventory icon as well before it became a proper vehicle. 2 icons are for a landmine and detonator, which was added in off the record. And there was an icon for the smashed version of a rotating display. The model itself still takes damage after you land a hit, but the inventory icon no longer updates. There's an icon for the flares that Sullivan uses, possibly meaning Chuck could pick them up at one point, or they even spawned around the map. Another solely adjacent icon is the original flashlight, which is more of a personal-sized one instead of the industrial-strength torch the final game uses. This old design can be seen on Sullivan's character model. There's an icon for the broken bike in Dead Rising 2 on its own, independent of any cart. Either you originally had to carry the thing back manually, dear god, or it was possible for the cart to break and then you would have to carry it back. That idea would be revisited Dead Rising 3 with Nicole White. Finally, there are 2 icons for Zombrex. I don't think either of these were in the game at the same time. Either these were going to be used for the Zombrex counter before it got streamlined to what we see today, or Chuck would need to actually have one in his inventory to give it to Katie. Thank God that last one wasn't in the game proper. Moving on to the weapons that actually were cut, there's a lot of Western-themed props with icons that didn't make it into the final game, including different variations of the acoustic guitar and Western portraits. My guess is these got dropped as the Americana aspect of Fortune City got condensed into a single location. There's a bullhead, likely replaced by the bull skull in the final game. There's a hay bale, which I'd wager was going to be included in the barbecue restaurant and some outdoor areas to give the map a more southern feel, but got cut when they feel it didn't add anything. There's a lantern, which might have been this game's answer to the toy laser sword at some point. Seems like something zombies could also carry around with these. The funniest cut Western weapon is the horseshoe. I'm certain this would have used the lawn dart animation. The final cut Western weapon would be a rocking horse, which probably would have been a gift for Katie. Okay, I know a rocking horse is hardly exclusive to any given Western theming, I just thought it fits here. Up next is the single largest type of cut item from the game, food, although not all of them were going to be healing items. At least 6 of them could have plausibly been weapons instead. A bag of rice and a tub of lard were going to replace the bacon ingredients and oil drum from the first game, although the cranberry juice is a bit weird. Its coating is as a weapon, and it's roughly the size of a battery. It's not clear if it was going to fit in the player's inventory or not, and it seems like it would just be another weapon that you throw and make zombies slip on. Chef Antoine's roast also has an inventory icon. I'm assuming this is a weapon, but it could have been that Chuck was able to feast on it like Nick can with the buffet in Dead Rising 3. But I prefer the idea that Chef Antoine's cooking is so bad it's only good as a weapon. The final 2 food items that could have actually been weapons, I'm a little more 50-50 on. The first is a box of butter, as it would make sense either way. It could just be something Chuck would eat, because eating an entire brick of butter is funny, or it could be a weapon, because beating a zombie to death with butter like it was a brick is funny. On the other end of the spectrum, the loaf of bread doesn't feel like it's fit to be either one. Whacking zombies with something like this as if it was a sandbag feels a bit out of place in Dead Rising 2, but Dead Rising 2 also doesn't have any examples of the player eating something straight through the packaging like the first game did. Regardless, moving on to the food proper, the single most important cut food item is fried rice. Why? Well, this indicated that the Jade Dragon was going to return at some point, expanded into a proper restaurant, and the fact that it is both modeled and has animations associated with it indicates that it was a pretty late cut. Even if that wasn't true, the bags of rice and the existence of the Hawaiian Surf Shack could indicate that this was going to go there as well. Now, the pancakes also have their model in the game, though it's not exactly clear why they were excluded, since there's a diner just outside the arena that would be perfect for them. Another major implication of cut food is that cooking was going to return from the first game. There are icons for raw chicken, ground beef, frozen pizza, cooked lobster tail, and a beef patty. That beef patty is interesting because, with how much ground beef you seem to get, it would make more than one. While it might seem weird to have a healing item with ammo, it's not the only piece of cut grub to imply such. There's a KFC-style bucket of fried chicken and buttered bread. And given both bread and butter were in the game at some point, it makes me wonder if Chuck originally had to put food items together to further expand the cooking mechanic, since a Soul Taco Shell and Wiener have icons in the files as well. But, to calm down for a minute, it's just as likely they thought it would be funny if you could find the ingredients to things like tacos and buttered bread, and phased out these expendable items as the game's file size got bigger. But they definitely did intend to bring cooking back, that much is clear, and I still want to hold out hope for the idea of fried chicken having ammo. There was also going to be a lot more alcohol in the game. There are icons and even models for things like fruit liquors, Bloody Marys, martinis, yardstick drinks, and a corkscrew drink. Most of them still have their sound effects and animations in the game too. These were probably trimmed down just to make the healing selection more streamlined, and to make it so that way mixed drinks were easier to keep track of. I still think the Bloody Mary should have stayed in though, especially since they originally had tomato juice as a healing item. This was just a retexture of the orange juice, but funnily enough, spawning it into the game apparently attracts zombies like a hunk of meat does. I guess the joke is that the zombies mistake tomato juice for blood. The remaining cut food items are fish and chips, likely cut because both parts can be found separately, a stick of salami, probably meant for a deli or the diner, mini donuts, replaced with the classic glazed donuts, a grilled cheese that looks like it never touched the pan, and finally a wheel of cheese. That last one I'm definitely annoyed got cut. There's a couple of weapons in the files that seem like they were meant to be boss weapons. There's a chef knife and a silver frying pan, two weapons that Antoine would have and should have dropped. There's the billy club that Seymour uses, which probably would have just been a super nightstick. Interestingly, there's also the blowtorch that Jed uses in Case Zero. Makes me wonder if that was going to be a boss drop at one point. The microphone mace that Kanye Wesker uses during his overtime mode boss fight also has an icon, so maybe that was going to be a reward for defeating him. Finally, and most disturbingly, there's a tranquilizer gun. It's labeled as a Deviant Magnum in the game's files, and Randy's giant pink chainsaw is called the Deviant Chainsaw. So, yeah. On top of the obvious story implications, this could have meant he originally would be slower and use this during his boss fight to slow you down, so he could then easily rush you down. In slightly less disturbing news, both the hedge trimmers and the katana from the first Dead Rising were scheduled to return, alongside a plethora of knives. A saber, a hunting knife, a basic knife, a gothic knife, and a turkey carver. A gardening tool and a claymore can also be seen in the files. Now, I doubt all of these were in the game at the same time personally. My guess is that they would swap around what could be found where in the world of Fortune City to see what they liked the most. And in their eyes, the Bowie knife, machete, and broadsword were the most appropriate. The hedge trimmers might have also been deemed too awkward to keep, and given that they were janky back in the first game, I sadly can't argue with that. Moving on to the guns, there's some early designs for several weapons. Most predominantly, the shotgun uses its Dead Rising 1 design. There's also a more muted color scheme for the 6-shooter, and strangely, a pink-colored version of the mercenary assault rifle. Overall, I think the designs in the final game are better. The short shotgun with a heat guard isn't as played out, while giving a strong color scheme. The 6-shooter looking properly cleaned implies Seymour treasured it, and the pink AR just looks goofy. The nail gun was going to return from Dead Rising 1. Given that it's just a worse pistol, the game adding boxes of nails for crafting, and the addition of the vending machines that drop pistols, it's easy to see why this one didn't make the cut. Some of the cut guns would find their ways into the sequels. The Proto-Man cannon would be finished and added in Off the Record, the paintball gun and spear gun would debut in Dead Rising 3, and the musket would appear in Dead Rising 4 as a melee weapon with a bayonet. There's also a Desert Eagle in the files. This one would go on to be used in Off the Record by Stacy, but only in a cutscene, and without any of its attachments. Now, the icon for an AK-47 actually invites some speculation. It's both a popular and cheap rifle, begging the question of whether this was meant to be a common rifle that would spawn on the map, or what the mercenaries were originally armed with at some point. The most interesting of the cut guns, however, is simply referred to as the Winchester. I say interesting because, while it appears to be a lever-action firearm in the icon, it's not clear if it's meant to be a shotgun or a rifle. Winchester as a company and brand are definitely most well known for their lever-action repeater rifles, and an 1800s repeater rifle would certainly complement the Western Americana theme that Fortune City originally went for. However, lever-action shotguns do exist, and I could see a group of Canadians just calling the lever-action version a Winchester in the files to keep track of it. There's also a version of the boomstick with the Winchester, further supporting the idea that it's a shotgun. However, it also has an attack animation left in the game that shows Chuck shoving something back with the gun, something that would make much more sense for a rifle than a shotgun to make some distance. So either they intended to have different versions of the shotgun, or this was Dead Rising 2's answer for the hunting rifle, and they experimented with the boomstick working with different guns. Some of you might be wondering about the SMG from Off the Record Plus. Well, that's not a cut weapon. That's a weapon used by TK for his boss fight, and the modders were clever and were able to turn it into a proper weapon. That's why I haven't brought up Off the Record Plus in this video. Not everything they added was strictly cut content. Moving to the furniture, There's a giant basket chair that seems to be the successor to the heavy chairs in Dead Rising 1's food court. There are additional wooden chairs of various sizes that go unused, some potted plants, one of which was meant to be in the Italian restaurant you fight Chef Antoine in, a basic garbage can, a black vase, a giant novelty watch, stuff like that. There are two very specific icons for the broken mannequin. A torso of the male variant, like in the first game, and a female version where the head and arms broke off, but not the legs. This could mean that the two mannequin models broke apart differently at one point in development, to give them a bit more individuality. There was going to be an industrial wood chipper, which was likely cut to make the lawnmower a bit more prevalent, and a heavy stack of newspapers that were likely cut in favor of the mailboxes, newspaper boxes, and the single rolled up newspapers you use for Molotovs. Originally, gift baskets could be found as a weapon, noticeably different from the one TK asked for in overtime mode. I imagine this would have just been found in the hotel and it might have been a quest item for a survivor. And there's also an icon for a flagpole. I imagine this would be wherever they intended to put paintball guns. In Dead Rising tradition, a good deal of these cut weapons were just run-of-the-mill tools. A lot of these seem to be like something you would just shove into a zombie's head or mouth. A mini screwdriver, a trowel, a socket wrench, and most concerningly, a rail spike. That last one's probably another leftover from when Fortune City was a Wild West park. The oil can was likely turned into the motor oil we see in the final game, and the smart saw was dummied out since the cement saw filled the role just fine. There's a farming hoe, which probably would have worked like the rake in terms of its attack animations, stronger, but not necessarily that common. A meat tenderizer that I imagine you use like the nail hammer in Dead Rising 4, and a toolbox. Out of all of these, the toolbox is the one that should have stayed. A lot of materials for combo weapons could easily be gotten from these when you break one. There's also the wheelbarrow. I feel like this is already one of the more well-known cut weapons in the game, as it is one of the few that you can get working again. This was likely dropped since the wheelchair and utility cart get the job done. Also, weirdly enough, there's a lone trading shield without a sword, and even more bizarrely, a tire pump. I guess with that one you would just inject it into a zombie and pump it repeatedly to make the head pop. The files also show they wanted to bring back a cut feature from the first Dead Rising with the ability to use zombie limbs as you dismember them as weapons. This is seen through the inventory icons for an arm, a leg, and the intestines. That last one implies the disembowel was going to return as well. I know it may be weird to think about, but remember that the first Dead Rising was a really good showcase for what the 360 could do, and the Dead Rising 2 saga was basically the system's swan song in hindsight, so it makes sense that they'd want to give this idea another shot. Although I'd wager that the memory issues this presented were not worth it, hence why they were cut. Memory issues is also likely why the baseballs and tennis balls were cut, since presumably Chuck was going to be able to pick them up after firing them out of a baseball bat or tennis racket. And speaking of the tennis racket, there's a version of it that's broken as if you smashed it over a zombie's head. Maybe that would be something you could do when you ran out of tennis balls originally. The remaining cut weapons don't fit into any proper grouping, so this'll be the etc. category. There are two other possible gifts for Katie, including her handheld game console and what looks to be a handmade doll. I wonder if the console would only appear in cutscenes if Chuck gave it to her, or if it was something Chuck would have to go back to retrieve during Case 1. There's a face mask that was possibly meant to help deal with the gas zombies. It got turned into a cosmetic item, probably so Repulse could serve that role. Two cell phone icons exist in the game's coding, one being for a giant novelty version. The smaller one would have probably reused the Brick's attack animations. This weapon was meant to return in Dead Rising 3, but it got cut from that game as well. There's a single poker card in the game's files. The only way I could see this working is if it was a giant novelty one that's used like the particle board, but nothing in the file suggests that was actually the case, so I don't know. The perfume was going to return from Dead Rising 1, though this time in a proper glass vase. It might have been something you would spray on zombies to attract others to it. That seems a bit in line with how Dead Rising 2 wanted to expand zombie interactions. And while this was an item from the first Dead Rising coming back, the pool cue was also meant to debut in this game, but would have to wait until Case West to properly appear. There's a junk version of the peace art in the game's files. I imagine this was supposed to be alongside the peace art instead of being a combo weapon made from it, and they cut it so that way players didn't accidentally grab the wrong one for Vicky's request. Of all the cut weapons in the game, the parking meter might be my favorite. It's because I imagine this being Dead Rising 2's answer to the mailbox in the first game, being an improvised hammer that eventually breaks into an improvised spear. This next one wasn't found from the cutting room floor, but instead from the concept art, as the developers had 3D models of weapons on display, and one of them included a 3D model for a bottle of glue made for the game, but never implemented nor kept in the files. It's possible that this one was never even intended to be in the game proper and was just done for testing. There's a stack of ninja stars that look way too professionally made to be a combo weapon, but doesn't fit with any theming in Fortune City, not even the beta versions. Unless these were going to be secret weapons like the SMG in the first game, I have no clue what these were intended for. The beer hat was originally made with a blue hat, maybe a baseball cap, and used beer cans instead of bottles. There's a cut combo weapon featuring 2 pitchforks taped together. While no details are given for it, I'm pretty sure it would be a modified version of the pitchfork's heavy attack. Stab a zombie, fling it backwards to kill it, and in doing so, you would then have the other side positioned to do the same, allowing for an ever-looping grapple attack. I could even see this weapon being called the pinwheel. I guess Capcom Vancouver didn't want a combo weapon that uses the same weapon for both components, a detail they were weirdly consistent with throughout the series. There's an inventory icon for a crutch in the game's files. I could see this working in the first Dead Rising with the heavy thrust attacks some weapons had, like the mannequin leg or the lipstick prop. But for Dead Rising 2, I think this was originally meant to be something you give to an injured survivor so they could move more quickly and defend themselves, but was phased out in favor of the Leadership magazine. And for the single weirdest cut item, a DVD with a musket on it. Not a stack of DVDs, just a single one. I wonder if DVDs were originally going to replace books in this game, or if this was just going to be a special example. Admittedly, getting the knowledge of a film without watching it, but instead just holding it, is very in line with the sense of humor for this series. My guess is that it would give firearms the additional attacks and double ammo that the military DLC does in the final game.